It is Friday, March 7th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Split Fiction episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PS Plus reminder. The March games are now live on PSN, so make sure you claim those games. Also, a little PSA here, but a lot of people were reaching out asking what's going on with that 5-day extension Sony promised for the PSN outage. Well, that should now be showing on account statements. So if you want to verify this, go to your account settings, go to subscription management. There should now be 5 additional days from what was your previous original expiry date for PS Plus. So just go ahead, validate that. It should now be live for most users on PSN. Now, getting into our first news story and keeping up with more PS Plus news, Sony has added more PS5 game streaming titles to this hidden catalog of games that you don't necessarily see, because if you remember when Sony launched PS5 server blades to stream PS5 games directly on the console, that was something where they're not part of the, well, they could be, but they're not strictly a part of the PS Plus premium catalog. These are games that you might own and they're in your collection, and you could either download them or now stream the PS5 version if you're, again, a premium member. So this has been a hidden list of games. We don't know how big it is, but we actually do, because this was reported by TLOU DualSense, where they run a script weekly to see if there's any new games that are being whitelisted as streamable. So recently, Sony whitelisted another 371 games for a grand total of 1,850 PS5 titles. So recently, they added games like Helldivers 2, Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza, Warhammer 40k. There's so much we could list off, but these are on the new PS5 server blades, where they're a lot more playable. If you've got 25 megabits per second down, then you can play these games at full 4K 60 FPS. They look gorgeous. There's minimal streaming artifacts, minimal latency. Now, if you're sensitive to that stuff, and I am, so I can usually pick up on that, and it's also very dependent on the genre you're playing. But the point is, they're like substantially better than the PS3 and PS4 server blades. And the weird thing, too, is that it's a stark contrast from how Sony approached this with PS Now originally on PS3, Vita, PS4, and that it was a very calculated marketing effort of trying to sell that and push that on people. Like, PS Now, we're advertising it constantly. Here's the new games that are coming out this month. Sign up, and it works on Sony TVs, select, Samsung models, bring over a DualShock 3 or a DualShock 4, and it's just, they don't really do that right now. And in a weird way, it's like 10 times better than it was 10 years ago, right? It's almost like they're just carefully, sort of building out the technology, building up the library, and slowly expanding it on devices where it makes sense. That's why you're not really, for most people, if you're a premium member, streaming a PS5 game on the console. You just download it unless you want to play it right then and there or something. So I'm sure there's some use cases, but like, it makes way more sense on, say, the Portal. That's why people are so excited for that, because you're no longer tethered to a personal PS5 console. So there's that. The possibility of it finally going to PC or televisions, which I still find that devices outside of console, it's still, very additional, and I think that transitionary period is further along than people think. But I think Sony is now recognizing that in a way where you wouldn't know they're up to 2,000 games. They're not really sort of pushing this in your face like this is the primary way you should be playing games, and sign up now, and they want to try and move people over to that as quickly as possible. It's an option, and I actually appreciate that they're going in a much more careful manner, I guess we could say, despite me also preferring physical games and local play as most people do. But it's definitely a very different landscape versus PS Now on the prior consoles. Next up, PlayStation 3 Firmware Update 4.92 is now live on PSN. That's right, a brand new PS3 firmware in 2025. Sony says it's for system performance. Really, what it is the annual Blu-ray keys update. So this is one of those things where it does happen annually around the same time, and it's pretty much always just for that. As far as I know, because anytime a PS3 firmware comes up, people immediately think, oh, it's Sony trying to get on top of custom firmware and hackers and all that. They're not concerned with that stuff. I can almost assure you that's not what this is. Every time they do the annual update, it's for Blu-ray keys. Now, obviously, if you are running a console with custom firmware or something, you're going to want to hold off on that until the community makes sure that they can clear this firmware. But yeah, it's like the same headline that pops up every year now, and it's like some places are just not doing their due diligence and letting people know, like, it's really for this. It's for the Blu-ray keys, not for anything else, or at least in theory we think that's what's going on. In other firmware-adjacent news, Sony has announced a new initiative called Beta Program at PlayStation. So what this is a more consolidated way to do multiple betas across different users based on your own play habits, things like that. So it is a new program you can sign up to. Sony says this can be on PS5, PC, or mobile, and it could be testing console features, PS mobile app features, play tests, pretty much anything. So if you're in the program, you could receive an invitation to a specific beta, and then you can opt in or out at your leisure, and it's free to register right now, so anybody can do it as long as your account is in good standing. And we do know it is account specific, so sharing codes will not work as it has previously, and Sony does say that you're signing an NDA, so sharing content, screenshots, videos, you're not allowed to do that, which you were never allowed to do, but that has always been a big difference, is that they can't really control that unless they get super, aggressive with doing copyright takedowns or something, because obviously people will share beta footage almost immediately, but, certain betas, if it's like updates to, let's say, game base or parties, the way parties work, messages. Usually a code, they'll say expressly that, hey, here's a code because you're in the old beta program, and they would say that you can share this code 5 times or 10, 20 times. Like, they would encourage people to share it and use it. They always say don't talk about it or make it public, but, they would do betas like that. Other betas would be a one-time use code, but it would be something where it gets emailed and it's not account specific, so you can still claim it. And that's pretty much the only way I ever get access to these things. I've never really been allowed into the beta program. So in this case, I did find it noteworthy that, yeah, it looks like they are trying to consolidate this down, do it across more devices. Maybe they want to really start fleshing out betas and play testing and this consumer feedback loop more than they've done previously. But I do find it noteworthy that this time around they're expressly saying that codes cannot be shared. It's account specific. So maybe they will be a bit more aggressive in making sure that people are not spreading this info out. Now, it will probably happen anyway, but those that are in the beta would probably get kicked out versus how it's been previously, where it's like if you're in, you just always got emails for those codes. I don't know, that was just how I was reading it, but it might be a bit more difficult for me to start covering these now, considering if I was in it, I can't share it, and I would want to do that, and I can't get codes from others, so that would complicate things a bit, but chances are we're still going to find out all these things anyway, as the internet does like to do. Let's move on to some Last of Us news, beginning with this one. A special edition DualSense was announced just yesterday, and my god, this thing looks gorgeous. This may just be one of the best DualSense controllers they've made, next to the Astrobot one. At least for the colorway, I think the reverse color of the standard controller is what makes this thing really sort of pop out. So black is now white, white is now black. Then you've got the white logos from the franchise on there. And then there's like glossy black icons of just things from The Last of Us, Uncharted. There's also a precursor orb on there, a strange relic, if you will. So this thing looks unbelievable. Sony does say it's going to be in limited quantities, retails for $84.99 from PS Direct and participating retailers, and pre-orders begin March 14th with the launch of April 10th, so trying to coincide that with the Season 2 premiere of the series on HBO. But yeah, this thing looks amazing. I still don't know, like, if I would even try to get it personally, because, like, the Astrobot one, loved it, it looks amazing, but I skipped it. I'm just kind of done with, like, buying special controllers, and especially with the Edge, it just makes it so much less of a use case of actually playing with the controller. I'm always going to use an Edge, so they're all shelf fodder controllers at that point. So I'm kind of done buying these things. It looks amazing. I don't think I'll try and go for it, but I would caution, like some of the other ones, you're going to want to probably be right on top of this March 14th if you're looking to pick this up, because I expect that it probably will sell out. In other Last of Us news, we also got a very surprising answer from Naughty Dog's president Neil Druckmann about the possibility of a third game. So recently he was speaking with Variety for The Last of Us HBO, primarily talking about that, but he was, of course, asked about the possibility of a third game, so he gave this answer here where he says, and I quote, "I was waiting for this question. I guess the only thing I would say is don't bet on there being more Last of Us. This could be it. Now, if you recall, this goes pretty much right against the ending of the documentary for the development of The Last of Us Part 2, Grounded 2, where Neil at the time said, and I quote, "I've been just thinking about it. Is there a concept there? And for years now, I haven't been able to find that concept, but recently that's changed. And I don't have a story, but I do have that concept that, to me, is as exciting as 1, as exciting as 2, is its own thing, and yet has this through line for all 3. So it does feel like there's probably one more chapter to this story." So very confusing in a way, right? Because you could read too much into it, or you could not and sort of brush it aside. It seems very clear that when they say things, Neil's not dumb. He knows this will make headlines, and certainly the end of Grounded 2, the documentary, which was a whole production, to have that be the closing statement for the whole thing, like, what does that tell you? You know, it doesn't mean we're going to get it in the next 3-4 years. We know that they're now very busy with Intergalactic, but that doesn't, rule out the possibility of a smaller team that is working out the very early concept stage of, say, Part 3. And maybe this statement could be inferred as them sort of cooling down or backpedaling from the expectations of when that game would happen. Maybe this very early concept phase game that they're doing is not Part 3, and that means we're more than 10 plus years away from a third entry. There's a lot of ways I think it could be interpreted, but it very clearly does kind of backpedal from that Grounded 2 statement. So that's at least how I'm reading it. Although it's also funny, I guess, because you look at Neil and he's one of those people where it would not surprise me at all if retirement is like on the table within 10 years or so, right? And it's very similar to a Final Fantasy VII Remake project where all the core creators and initial director and producer and all those guys were like, oh man, if we don't do this remake now, like, we're aging out of the industry. Like, it's now or never. And that's kind of how that whole thing kicked off. Last of Us is Neil's baby in a way. So you would think that he wants to see that project through before he retires, if that is in like the next 10 years or something, right? So there's that point to consider. I'm also seeing some talk about this now, and it's like, oh, well, Sony's not going to let them not do Part 3. But like that kind of touches on something we've been going over a lot recently, which is this explanation of the relationship between Sony and their studios, which is they have their own, the studios rather have their own agency. They can pitch to Sony. They can kind of do what they want in a lot of cases, but it's a weird thing where if Sony's looking for certain things, that will put some pressure or expectations on the studio to pitch things that they know will get backing from Sony. But Naughty Dog is, a very upper echelon studio that kind of gets to do what they want in a lot of cases. So they can, choose to do Intergalactic. They can choose to, spend a lot of time on Last of Us multiplayer, then kind of back out of that. Not to say there's no repercussions or something, but you know what I mean, right? It's what we've said before. The studios can make pitches and also walk away from franchises. So it's weird to me that I'm seeing so many people say like, oh, well, Sony of course wants Part 3. Sure, but at the same time, like, we're talking about PlayStation where they've historically walked away from franchises all the time. That's kind of why we have this vicious cyclical cycle of people asking for IP for them to go back to. It's like they drop IP all the time. So The Last of Us is big, sure. If they really wanted it, maybe they would want to go to another studio, but at the same time, they would probably respect Naughty Dog's wishes of, we don't want other studios to touch that IP. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where I sit on that argument here, but it does sound like Part 3 might not be happening within the next maybe decade. I don't know. It's really tough to say. He could also just be throwing people off for a loop, and they really are planning on doing it. I'm sure that's also a distinct possibility as well. Moving on to some live service news, which is very similar to what we saw with the Ben Studio game that is now canceled. We did see some early screenshots from that game, and it was from, I believe that was an online resume. So same thing here for the Twisted Metal project, which, if you remember, was in development at Lucid Games, then moved over to Firesprite in around 2022, then canceled late 2023 as part of a portfolio review at Sony. And so, yeah, we do have another online resume that showed off very similar similar early screenshots. So very basic sort of concept here that we can at least get a rough idea of what this game was going to look like, which it was described as a third-person battle royale where it had third-person shooting outside of the vehicle in addition to the vehicle combat, and it was codenamed Project Copper. So we know the game's not coming out anymore, but at least it was cool to see this stuff, which it's always fun to get this stuff after knowing that the game is not going to see the light of day. But it does track with, well, prior job listings, which it was always slightly weird to hear third-person shooting in those job listings, and now we see why. But the other angle of it is that it was at Lucid Games for a bit, and that was the whole gameplay loop for Destruction All-Stars, which that was vehicle combat, but you could get out of the car and run around, and there was a whole thing they were trying to do there. And so that's where Twisted Metal was going to go, was now having third-person shooting in addition to the vehicle combat, which is, it sounds weird, of course. I will say, and this is coming from somebody that's like not a huge Twisted Metal person, that makes sense to me as far as, like, I guess trying to evolve the concept and maybe trying to modernize the franchise in a way that is maybe more appealing. Calling it a battle royale, like, yeah, that's what Twisted Metal always was, so that's not a shocker. But the third-person shooting does seem a little bit unusual, but we're not going to see the game anyway, so it's just always enlightening to get these screenshots, knowing that the game, this is what it was, that's what it looked like, and that's where they were trying to take the franchise, which, for better or worse, it's not going to happen now. Next up, we have a minor update for the Horizon multiplayer game, where Guerrilla Games has brought in a former senior design lead at Bungie, and that is Chris Proctor. So he recently joined the company as the design director on the Horizon Online game, which could mean a number of things. I'm still expecting that we should see this game this year. It would be very surprising if this game was not ready to be shown off and also launch in some kind of early state and is playable by the end of this calendar year. I would be very surprised otherwise, but we know it's been in development since 2018, being directed by Simon LaRouche. Usually these big roles being filled in or changed can sometimes be indicative of a turbulent development cycle, or it could also mean that the game is nearing the finish line and you've got some that are ready to move on, or other roles being filled in to sort of take on what is now going to be a long-term, roadmap of content updates and seasons, things like that. You would assume this game's likely going to have a very similar roadmap that many other live service games have. So with that in mind, it's a small update, but one where I really hope we do see this game in the short term. Within a few months, I'm hoping we get a reveal for this game. Now, we also have another update for the secret LA studio that Sony is building. This is the Jason Blundell team in all likelihood. So we had a job listing here for a game systems designer, where it's the same line of text we've seen in other job listings for the studio, where it says, we are a newly established AAA studio based in Los Angeles, driven by a team of seasoned industry leaders and experienced game developers. Our mission is to create the next groundbreaking AAA original IP while reimagining the development process with a lean and highly efficient approach. We're seeking talented individuals who share our vision and are eager to join us on this journey. Now, this job listing does actually give us some insight into what the game might possibly be focused on. I think the natural expectation was multiplayer, but the job listing does say they're asking for experience and knowledge of cooperative multiplayer design, and it also mentions you'll be looking at player behavior, trends, expectations, looking at player feedback. So while it does explicitly say co-op, there is also a pretty big focus on player engagement as well. So, it could still lean into more of a multiplayer live service-esque focus, but this is the open secret AAA LA team, which is basically Jason Blundell's title. So we're still probably very far away from this game ever being a reality, and with how many cancellations we've had within the past 2 years, there's also a chance this game never happens. But for now, that's the latest update with this game. Now, moving on to some not so good job-related news, but PlayStation Studios Visual Arts was hit with more layoffs for those working out of San Diego. This was being discussed earlier in the week on LinkedIn, so a handful of people, we're not entirely sure how many, but we did have Kotaku reach out to Sony for comment. They did not respond, and then a few days later, we found out from nmiagaming.com that PlayStation Studios Malaysia were also hit with layoffs, with about a reduction of 20 staff members. And apparently the team was notified that the reduction was not based on the studio's performance, but just an effort to reduce the overall workforce, which is always not great to hear. Now, obviously, we can sort of connect this a bit in that we had cancellations from Bend and Bluepoint, and with PSVA and Malaysia, they are support studios. That's what they do. They have mocap, they do animation, they do all these roles that are meant to support the other PS studios. So with recent cancellations, you can see how this happened. And initially I thought, because we had the San Diego news first, I'm like, okay, well, that's also very likely Sony trying to reduce labor in California. They've said this much directly, which is trying to watch that and doing business on the West Coast. So in a weird way, that also goes right in the face of our prior news story where they've got a new LA-based studio. So it's like a tough thing to manage, obviously, because all the talent is in the West Coast in the United States. So it's one of those really tough things where they do have to hire people, but that's why the job listing for the Jason Blundell studio explicitly mentions a very efficient, lean team for game development. They don't want to have to hire all these people if they don't have to, which is awful. But that was what I initially thought was like, okay, reducing California labor and just increasing more in Malaysia. But no, Malaysia got hit too, because that Malaysia team has grown a lot in recent years. So it seems like they did have a lot of people probably assigned to both Bend and Bluepoint, if I had to guess. But unfortunately, these things continue to happen. This industry has still been incredibly brutal. It's not just been SIE, but it's just a lot more of it's been going on lately. Now, with that story behind us, we have more bad news, which is the developer Ballistic Moon, which was the new team made up of former Supermassive staff, where their first gig was remaking Until Dawn, which Sony contracted them out again to remake the game all these years later, and that all made sense. But yeah, they're not looking too good. So we're hearing from Insider Gaming, according to multiple sources with knowledge of the situation, that Ballistic Moon is effectively closed. So if you remember, back in September 2024, the studio laid off about 40 staff, and they were openly admitting at the time that that was necessary to keep the company afloat, and all the remaining staff would be doing post-launch support for Until Dawn until the game ships. But apparently in December, they quietly had more layoffs, with about 20 more staff members losing their jobs. So for now, it seems like it's only the founders and maybe a few other people are left, but it's otherwise effectively closed, as the team could not find new opportunities after pitching ideas to a new publisher. One source does say that Sony was a possibility for another game, but it sounds like that just never came to fruition. So they're not like 100% done, so the report does specifically say effectively closed, with founders and maybe a few other people, but that does directly go back to the September 2024 statement they put out, which was, and we talked about it too, it was like, it sounds like they're between contracts and they do not have anything lined up, which was very indicative of, okay, well, it's probably not Sony, right? Because that was the other thing too. It's like, well, this is a brand new team. Maybe this is their first gig where they're able to sort of prove their worth, and maybe that can lead to another agreement from Sony. But it seems like that just didn't really get anywhere. I mean, money is not exactly as abundant as it was initially when Ballistic Moon was formed, and that kind of goes back to the whole 2020 to 22 investment boom in the games business. So yeah, this is pretty tragic, and that's part of the reason why we've seen so many closures recently as well. So many new teams that did not even get the chance to ship a game at all. It sucks that in this case they had this like one sort of proven idea that they could see through, and the game also just came out in a very problematic state, and now it seems like the remaining issues that are there are not going to be addressed. So it's in a better state, sure, and I haven't played the game myself just yet, but I know for a fact, I'm hearing from so many people that the game still has a lot of issues that need to be fixed. So yeah, this is not a great situation, and you never want to see this for a game that is not going to be able to really get cleaned up in the manner that it should. But the whole thing's weird, right? Because it's also Sony not willing to commit to the resources for the team to clean up the game. They also just kind of put it out there and never really did any marketing or a huge push for it. And also, the movie is not here yet. You would think the movie could spike sales for the game on PS5 and PC. So there's like this window that the game didn't get to live through for the studio to see those returns based on whatever sort of agreement and royalties were in place. So this it's a huge bummer, and maybe that's why they're not 100% closed, because maybe they are entitled to more royalties if the game ends up doing well. That's just pure speculation on my part, but this is a weird one. It really is, and it's kind of a bummer that Ballistic Moon did not really get to go anywhere, or at the very minimum, find a new opportunity with a different publisher. Moving on to another Xbox news story. It feels like we have these every week now during this transitionary period, but in this case, it's actually about the hardware that they're going to put out in what we think is 2026, which seems very soon, more soon than Sony, obviously, which 2027 feels really soon. But the point is, this is a rumor coming from the Ghost of Hope on X. I have no idea if they're reliable, but this made a lot of headlines, so they're apparently very reputable in the Call of Duty and first-person shooter space. So the rumor they put out recently was for Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4, where they claimed that that entry of the game is going to drop PS4 and Xbox One. Also, it's going to have a traditional UI like the older games. The engine is being overhauled to address MW2's problems like visual clutter, no Warzone 3 if the OG map fails to retain current and returning players, but also it's being developed on dev kits for the next Xbox, which they've been making this claim since last year, and they've recently doubled down on this, but they are saying that this is a post that they're willing to, like it's a hill they're willing to die on, that this console is indeed coming in late 2026, with Infinity Ward having dev kits in use already. And it's a very weird thing, right? Because late 2026 is so soon, but for them, there's this, sort of theory running around that for them, it's going to be more just building an operating system that they will offer their own hardware, sure, but it's an OS that really blurs the lines between Windows and Xbox, and they'll let third-party manufacturers make Xboxes that are super low volume and crazy expensive because they're all basically PC games. And so there's a lot of different ways this can be looked at depending on what the company plans on doing, but it seems like that's their play, as the more traditional console market is one that they're clearly giving up on. And 2026 would be so soon, whereas Sony, we expect, late 2027 at the minimum. 28, I think, would feel right. I'm very much in agreement with Shuhei where 2028 does feel right. But the timeline that we know of right now for Sony is looking like 2027. So we could have a new Switch, this year. I mean, that's very likely going to happen. And then the following year will be Xbox, and then the year after that will be PlayStation. So, I mean, for me, new consoles, no matter what they are, they're always exciting. So I just love keeping up with all three in that respect. But it'll be fascinating with, I guess, how this relates to Sony and the sort of pressure Sony may or may not feel anymore to worry about what was previously their closest competitor putting out a box a year ahead of time. But, it's not quite like the 360 days where that was actually detrimental to them. So it's very strange. There's so many ways this could be discussed. But, for Sony, I think they're still very much in their own lane of following that traditional console market. We have a timeline and a bill of material that we're looking at and an SoC that we're building, and our schedule is 2027. And that's probably when we'll see PlayStation 6. Now, as for the Xbox news, that is more about the transitionary period and IPs coming over. One of the big IP that we're still missing is Gears of War, so in that case, we do have a rumor about the Gears of War collection coming to PS5. This comes from Detective Seeds over on X, so they do mention that this collection of games will come out in August. It will be on PS5 with Pro support, and there will not be any multiplayer PvP, which Jez Corden from Windows Central does corroborate that rumor by saying he's heard about the games and that, it's going to be only co-op for the game, so you can do co-op campaign, but there will be no arena-style PvP multiplayer. What's so funny about this rumor is not even so much the Gears of War IP now being on PlayStation. That is one of the big 3 for Xbox IP where, it's going to be a very surprising thing when it finally happens. And there's still some discussion around, where Xbox is nowadays and how it feels to have that kind of rumor floating around out there. but there's actually more talk I'm seeing of it like being genuine complaints of like, man, another PS3 360 era game, and they're not including the multiplayer, because we've seen so many of those games get remasters or ports on modern consoles, and almost always they drop the multiplayer, which is really more of a resource thing. And in some cases, if you're doing a collection of 3 games, you're not going to want to immediately split off the player pool with 3 separate, games that can offer a multiplayer mode. So it's one of those things. Arguably, that's maybe an IP where it could get away with doing 3 titles with a split player pool. Like, that's one of them. Halo's one of them, but not every game can really get away with that, I find, at least. But very likely a resource thing, budget. There's just no, it's just something where it wasn't even considered, I would think. And also it could really reinvigorate the IP, expose it to a new audience, and that gets the audience ready for the next mainline entry. So, and that will have multiplayer, right? So either way, we are hearing that Gears will be on PlayStation this year with Pro support. When that does become official, that will very much be just as weird as Forza or hearing about Fable. Forza is still like climbing up the charts, and so many people keep asking for that game to get a physical print, which I suspect might happen at some point. They're not doing it initially. They already confirmed that. My thing is, I would assume some of the proper Xbox Game Studio developers, not your Activision or your Blizzard, where they obviously have done physical releases on PlayStation, but some of the XGS studios that are under that umbrella, which have not seen the demand from PlayStation players or don't realize that there's a bigger split for the desire for physical media. Maybe that would come eventually, especially when you have companies like LRG that want to propose that to them. That's their business model. They might also facilitate that. So if you're upset about no physical for Forza, I would say give it some time. You never know. I think it would happen sooner than later. Moving on to a very minor PlayStation 6 adjacent news story, which is AMD acknowledging the Project Amethyst initiative that they have with Sony. They recently put out this tweet saying, "Happy Radeon Day. We're proud of our collaboration with PlayStation on Project Amethyst. FSR 4 is looking fantastic. Excited for the code development with Sony Interactive Entertainment on the models used for the FSR 4 upscaler. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned for what's next." If you remember from the PS5 Pro seminar, Project Amethyst is very much a collaborative effort between AMD and SIE. So in this case, it seems like it is very mutual as far as what Sony is providing for AMD with, say, FSR 4, so certain models that PSSR uses, and maybe certain advancements that AMD is exploring and using that directly helps and benefits PSSR and things that Sony's looking to accomplish on PlayStation 6. So it's a very minor thing, but AMD has not really made that many comments about Amethyst so far, and not exactly outlining Sony's involvement for their benefit, but that was a very small thing that I thought was at least worth pointing out. Moving on to a very bizarre update in the ongoing issue of all these shovelware games on PSN, where now it seems like Sony is in a very isolated situation actually advertising these games. So what happened here, this was reported on by PlayStation Lifestyle, then shared by Push Square, but there were these 2 Reddit posts that were complaining about this. Maybe it's a very isolated situation, but basically one is the German PlayStation account showing the Jumping Burger Halloween edition, and another one is the UK account on Instagram advertising Stroke the Tortoise. So that's like the complaint here is like, what are they doing? Why are they advertising these games? There's been so many complaints about how they flood the store and crowd the tiles, right? So it's kind of getting in the way of trying to find other things. It's hurting discoverability. Also, they hand out platinums, and that sort of devalues the trophy system. So what is going on here? Now, I think it would be fair to say it's not intentional. I mean, this is clearly things that are probably sort of algorithmically decided on as far as what kind of game they choose to serve to you, but it still doesn't look good. It's still kind of dumb. There should be some sort of blacklist behind the scenes to make sure that these games don't appear, but at the same time, they've seemingly got no system in place to differentiate these games in such a manner where they're deprioritized on the store, which they did do to a degree with the jumping games. As I've said before, they removed them initially as far as their visibility, but they're still there. They do creep into new releases at times, or when they release a demo for those games, they show up on the row of games. So they've still got to like really tackle this head on, and I don't know what the answer is. As I've said prior, like it does get a little bit muddy. It's not as black and white as it does appear to be, because if you make some kind of system that curates this, if it's not a manual human review for every single game, you're going to start rejecting games that should not have been rejected. Having said that, the advertising thing is silly. It doesn't look very good. It's also a regional thing. I think you'd be hard-pressed to ever see like the North American accounts do this by accident, but that's not a good excuse. You should still not have this ever be a thing where you're advertising this glowing software from the store that really you should be more embarrassed about, rather than having it be thrown into the algorithm for advertisements. Next up, let's go over the tariff situation here in the US and how that affects video game console pricing and also physical video games, which, as I've said before, it's hard to really report on this when things change so often. So usually it's not worth talking about every week when things change that often. And sure enough, within the last 8 hours, it's already different. And that was after the 48-hour window where a lot of people were scrambling off this headline that, yes, the U.S. administration did put in a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and 20% on China. But actually, so by the time you're watching this, just yesterday, they delayed the Mexico and Canada ones until April 2nd. So for Sony, this would impact their consoles from China, which the company did address this in their latest financial report, saying that they would stockpile consoles in the US. They've probably been doing that for quite a while now at this point, but those machines would run out at some point. And they did also say they would explore duplicating production, which is them basically saying they would find new suppliers, different production lines, things like that, which they've had them before. They've had them in Brazil, so that's a possibility. But for physical video games, this is where you've probably heard that Mexico is a problem if 25% does go through. We even had Matt Piscatella of Circana speculate about this on Blue Sky, where he did say that, if physical games do get hit with this tariff, then some games just might not even get printed. Because that would be based on the publisher, and if their split is primarily digital, then it would be in their interest to just drop the one access point instead of, say, having raised prices for both of them. Because it wouldn't be something where they raise prices on physical and keep digital the same price. They're just not going to do that. So there's that. But here's the issue, and it's kind of what I said before, where, as I understand it, Sony is fairly well positioned to try and navigate this in the interest of keeping physical media going, but it would be still dependent on the publisher, obviously. Just in the case of, I guess, Sony games, it would be a bit more beneficial. So as I explained before, like, they have a plant in Indiana in the US. It's the Sony DADC facility, The issue is, like, they don't manufacture discs. They do bring those in from Mexico, but that facility is still a very large logistical output for North American software. So they do take care of the cases. I believe they print the box art there, and that's where they fulfill and ship. And, so they've got a large portion of the business model in place in the United States to print discs. To put a 25% tariff on that, that's where it's like, obviously the 25% is not on $70 video games. It's a portion of the material. So in theory, publishers on a case-by-case basis, they could probably safely eat that if they wanted to, or completely absorb the cost. But, at the same time, 25% at a very large scale, even if it's only a very small portion of the bill of materials, it's still a lot of money. It's still a hit to the balance sheet, and that's why it's going to be problematic. But, Sony has the facility in the U.S. that takes care of a good portion of that. They've got the Brazil facility as well, where they handle physical software for South American PS4, PS5 games, and I believe they also get their discs from Mexico, but they're in a free trade zone where, if they had to, I would think they could also get those, like, if they wanted to start working out of that facility, they could bypass Mexico, bring it in over air or sea or something. I mean, it's obviously, this is like the kind of scope where I'm theorizing. I don't know what Sony's options realistically are, and things are always changing because, again, like, it's already been delayed. So the tariffs are not in place just yet for physical video games, if they would be affected. But it's just been a very complicated mess of nonsense. And look, I have no problem saying this. this was not the administration I wanted. This is just one of many issues that it's just a non-issue. This didn't need to happen, and it's affecting a hobby we all love, and it's going to get really expensive for hardware, which is already happening right now. And you've got all these companies that are going to have to try and navigate this in a way where they're not passing on these costs to the consumer, but in many cases, there's no getting around it, right? It's one of many fundamental issues, and especially for physical media, where like, yeah, a lot of people are choosing to download games nowadays, and that's all well and good, but this is a topic I care about. I really advocate for the option of physical media, and that's because it's so consumer friendly too. All the power is with you as far as buying from whoever. You've got retailers that can price match. You can buy used. You can share rental programs. I mean, there's a reason why I care so much about physical video games. And to have this sort of accelerate in a way where the death of it comes faster than it needs to be, it really sucks. So with that in mind, though, both on the hardware and software side, Sony, I think, has some avenues they can explore, and surely they are. Like any good fiscally responsible company, they're going to want to make sure this can impact them in the smallest way possible. But it sucks, but we'll watch this and see what happens. For now, it's still delayed. Next up, we have some sales data coming in from the UK, focusing on two topics that are very interesting. One is the PlayStation Portal, and one is physical games, as we just talked about before. So with the Portal, we do know that throughout all of 2024, reported by the GfK, that Sony sold 143,000 units, which would make the PS Portal the 6th best-selling accessory and number 1 when ranked by revenue, which is very similar to what we hear in the US, where almost always every month it's number 1 ranked by revenue. That's because of the $200 MSRP. But yeah, the Portal is this device that has seemingly done much better than Sony expected. We still at least know as a baseline that it's about 3% of the entire PS5 install base. So it's a little over 2 million something units, which is still a decent enough amount where that's likely the most engaged PlayStation customers buying and playing on the Portal. But we're also hearing for physical games. This comes from Christopher Dring, the former head of GamesIndustry.biz. He also made a comment about the game sales, and he released this data, which is in the UK. As an example, 81% of sales for Space Marine 2 were digital, but Astrobot, 55% of sales were physical. So it's been a while since we've had a very recent split like that for a first-party game. We were using the Insomniac breach data for a little bit, which was a few years old, which is recent, but also not recent in the sense where things can change very quickly. But we've had talks about this before, where when it comes to the ratio of physical and digital, and certainly the broader ratio that Sony puts out from their financial reports, where it's usually in the 70s, sometimes 80s, and that's a lot, obviously, but that number can be skewed because it includes everything on the PlayStation Store, and it also is a publisher by publisher thing. So Chris put out a very good metric, which is, and this was indicative from the Insomniac breach, first-party PlayStation games do favor physical quite a bit more. Not more overall, but just, it's more even nowadays, which in 2025 is still pretty crazy and cool to see for a game like Astrobot, which sold millions of copies. And that's a lot of physical software still being bought and sold. So it's still very important depending on the kind of game it is and where it's coming from. And I thought it at least bodes well for this news amongst all the negative stuff going around, and more so the question going into PlayStation 6. We've had so many indicators now from not just former PlayStation leadership, but just raw numbers showing that very likely PlayStation 6 will offer physical media. It's just, how is that going to look? Is it still going to be a detachable drive? Will Sony continue printing PS6 software themselves, which seems more and more likely that will be the case, but will it be just more of a compliant device, or will it be similar to what we've seen with every PlayStation cycle, which is here's PS6 and here's some PS6 games? And it's looking like that may still be the case, assuming we don't have major hurdles getting in the way of that. Now, with Astrobot in mind, we of course have to mention that the BAFTAs are coming up very soon on April 8th. And sure enough, Astrobot is nominated for many categories, not just Best Game, but also Game Design, Animation, Artistic Achievement, Audio Achievement, music, family, and technical achievement. So Astro is once again propped up on a very prestigious award ceremony, and it's looking like it probably will win something. Best game? I don't know. It might do it again. It is kind of the front runner. It's been winning the most Game of the Year awards, and I just sincerely did not expect that. So I'm going to simp a little bit more for Astrobot here, but man, I am loving it. And we'll see April 8th how many more W's it picks up. But if I was a betting man, I would say it's got a few more W's in its future. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Tuesday video was a repackage of the Astrobot playthrough I did when the game came out. Honestly, I forgot to upload that. I made it right next to the full playthrough because I thought, oh, this might be good to watch if somebody only wants to see the cameo reactions. And I never uploaded it. I forgot. So I was like, okay, well, I can use that for Tuesday because I need more time for what should be this coming Tuesday's video, because we might be exploring more PS1 memory cards, and I've been spending a lot of time playing and trying to finish out some of those games. So that's been super fun. But that should hopefully be this coming Tuesday. Fingers crossed. And then we also had another Click R3 episode as well, so you can go check that out. And then that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.